Hey there. Today, I'm going to show you how to connect to REST APIs using CloverDX. For my example, I'm going to be getting a list of accounts from the API of an accounting software called Xero. We're going to do this in two main steps. The first step is establishing a connection between CloverDX and your API. For our example, we're going to use OAuth today. Then, we're going to make the request to the API, get the response, and parse the response, all using one component, the RESTConnector. Let's get started. So the first step is to establish a connection between CloverDX and your API. There's many ways to do this. There's simple username and password, there's bearer tokens, there's API keys, but a really common one, and the one that we're going to use today for Xero, is OAuth. Okay, so because an OAuth connection in CloverDX is going to be encrypted, we're going to need to make sure that first we set up a master password. So to do that, if you're running a server project, then just go to the server page and navigate down to Configurations, Security, and you can set up a master password. Or if, like me, you're using a local project, you can go to Window, Preferences, and then just type master pass here. And you can see mine is already set. You can set yours if you haven't already, and then we're good to go. Once that master password is set, CloverDX can handle the encryption necessary to set up the OAuth connection. So I'm going to go to the bottom left and go to Connections, right click that, and select Create OAuth to Connection. Name this whatever you want. I'm going to name mine Xero Connection. Okay. Then you can see where it says provider. I'm going to use generic, but this is a cool feature. If you're using one of the bigger ones like Azure, GitHub, Google, then CloverDX will let you just go to this drop-down menu and it'll actually have a lot of the information auto-populated for you that you're going to need. So really cool feature if you're using one of the more common APIs, but I'm just going to use generic for now for my Xero API. So we have two tabs. We have basic and advanced. We're actually going to start with advanced. So the first thing that we need is the authorization endpoint, and the second is the token endpoint. These you'll need to get directly from the documentation from your API. Most of your APIs are going to have easy documentation with OAuth 2 there somewhere, and you can find the things that you need to find. I've got them here that I'm just going to copy and paste directly in. Authorization endpoint and token endpoint. Okay. And then this third one, redirect URL. This one's really important. We're going to have to take this to our API on their side for the setup. So I'm going to use it exactly as it says here, localhost 62926. All right. So I've copied that. And now I'm going to go back to my API page to get the things that I need for the basic. So if I go to developer.xero.com or whatever it is for your API to set up a new app, I'm going to name it RESTConnector, web app. You can use anything for company or application URL. I'm just using example.com. But then here, redirect URI. This is important. This needs to be exactly the same as what we put into Clover. So I've copied and pasted that there. And let's create app. Great. Now, if I go to configuration, this, we can see the redirect URI again there. And then here I can get a client ID and a client secret. These are the things that I'm going to need for the basic tab. So let's copy first the client ID and then copy second the client secret. Great. So now the last thing that we need to fill in is scopes. Again, you're going to have to go to the documentation for your particular API to find out what scopes you need. Scopes basically just means these are the things that you're going to have access to, that you're telling the API to allow you to have access to. So for my project, I know that I need the scopes offline access, and accounting.settings. All right. So once we've made sure we filled in all of these fields, then let's just go to, I like to authorize an external browser, and we click authorize. And it should take you to your API's page. I see RESTConnector wants access to, and I'm going to select demo company, allow access. And if everything worked, you should see a big green sign that says connection has been authorized. And if you go back to Clover, you should see down here in the bottom, it says connection is authorized. Awesome. All right, now that we've finished step 1, connecting our API to the CloverDX, now we can start adding components and getting the data that we're looking for. So let's start by adding a REST connector. Okay, and we'll connect the output edge here. All right. I'm going to use this REST connector to get accounts information. So I'm going to name that accounts. All right. And let's look at what's inside of this REST connector. So the first thing we see is the OpenAPI URL. This is the most important part of the REST connector. The REST connector uses the OpenAPI specification, which is a YAML or JSON file created by your API that tells it all the information it needs to know about your API. Tells it the endpoints, tells it the parameters, tells it what the responses are going to look like. With this OpenAPI specification, the REST connector can do almost all the work for you. So my API, if you don't have an OpenAPI specification, you won't be able to use the REST connector, but you can still connect to the API with the HTTPS connector and get everything that you need. So let's look at my OpenAPI specification here. This is the one for accounting from Xero, and I'm just going to copy the URL and bring that right here to the URL. Then the next thing I need is the API root URL, which you can find right there in this OpenAPI specification. So we'll just copy that also. All right, and then here's where Clover starts doing the work for you. If I see endpoint here and I just click these 3 dots, it's going to read the OpenAPI specification and bring me a list of all the possible endpoints that I can connect to. I don't have to remember them all. I don't have to remember how they're spelled. They're all right there for me. So I'm going to use accounts get, and all I have to do is click it. And there we go, set up. When I get to authentication, I need to pick my OAuth 2 connection that I created earlier. All right. And again, if we don't have OAuth, we could use bearer token, password, API key, etc. But we're using OAuth today. All right. So now with the OpenAPI specification, it's going to know, the REST connector is going to know what possible parameters I can use. I can use order or where as query parameters. Neither of them is required. It can tell me what the HTTP headers that I need are. If modified since, not required, but 0 tenant ID is true, required true. So before I'm going to be able to connect to this endpoint, I'm going to need a 0 tenant ID, which this is cool because now we get to use 2 REST connectors. So I know that to get this tenant ID from the documentation of Xero, I need to make an API call to their identities API. So we're going to go ahead and set up a second REST connector. So first, let's select our OAuth 2 connection again. All right, and then for the OpenAPI URL, we'll go back, and here is their OpenAPI specification for their identity API. So I copy that OpenAPI URL, and then I need the root URL, which is right here. Cool. And then again, 3 dots, endpoints. This one doesn't have nearly as many, but we're just going to click on connections get. Awesome. So now this one doesn't have any request things that we need to put in, but we're going to go to response, JSON response mapping. So my favorite part of the REST connector is that it knows from reading the OpenAPI specification, the REST connector knows what the data is going to look like coming out of the 200 response. Even if the OpenAPI specification is specific enough, it could show us 400, 500 responses. This one shows us only the 200 response. So I know that it's going to be a body JSON with these fields. So I'm going to go ahead and map my body JSON to port 0. Okay. And I can drag any of these over. All I need is the tenant ID. So we're going to go ahead and put the tenant ID there. We're going to name our metadata here. We're just going to call it tenant ID. Okay. So now, if I click OK and OK, oops, it automatically created a trash because I forgot to connect an output edge first. We'll get rid of that. Oops. Tenant ID. Okay, make sure my mapping is still there sometimes if I don't set it up right. Yeah, cool. Everything's great. All right. So the tenant ID is now this REST connector, which I'm going to call tenant ID, is going to make a call to their identities identities API, and then it's going to send the tenant ID over on this edge to my accounts REST connector. So let me show you how that part works. All right. So if I go to my request and my input mapping, I can see here that the tenant ID field is going to come in on the input edge. And I can see over here the additional HTTP headers, 0 tenant ID right there. So all I have to do is drag and drop tenant ID onto 0 tenant ID and click OK. And now when it receives the tenant ID from the first REST connector, it will make the call using the tenant ID that it got from the input edge. Awesome, right? So now let's go to the JSON response mapping. Again, this is my favorite part of the REST connector. It knows what it's going to look like, and so I can just easily take my JSON. So this one we can see it's going to have the body JSON is going to have a list of accounts, and then for each account it's going to have all of this information. So I'm just going to click accounts, click port 0 for that output edge, and then I want just like these first 6 fields. We'll just pull those right over, and we'll go ahead and name this accounts. Name my metadata. Cool. So all of these things, all of these fields are just going to come directly from the JSON. The REST connector knows what it's supposed to look like. It's great. Okay. So now if I run this, I will make a call to the identities API, and then that's going to send the tenant ID here, and it's going to make a call to the accounts API. And if I get a 200 response, because that's what I mapped for my JSON mapping, then that's going to come out of the 0 edge, the output port 0. What if I don't get a 200 response? What if I get a 400 or 500? Well, then it's just going to fail. So let's go ahead and take care of that as well. Let's create another edge on output port 1. And here, next to our JSON response mapping, we have default output mapping. So we've told it when there's a 200 response, send this up to output port 0. Now we can tell it, we'll call this metadata response. Okay. Now we'll tell it if it's anything else, send all that data down to output port 1. Awesome. Okay. So now I'm going to run this. And if I get a 200 response, everything's going up north. If I get anything else, it's going to come down south. Let's see what happens. Aha, it all came south on output port 1. What happened? Well, here's my error message. I can see it says unexpected character with this little caret. Now what that means is, I know this because I've used this before, this is returning XML instead of JSON, this API. So if you were paying attention, you might have noticed I've referred over and over to JSON response mapping. So JSON response mapping obviously can only return if it's a JSON. It doesn't know what to do if it gets something other than JSON. So if you have another format like here, XML, you would have to use a different connector, a different component to parse that. But luckily for me, I know that my API allows me to make another HTTP header called accept and then application/JSON. So that's telling it to return the data as a JSON instead of an XML. So now when I run this, I should get everything going north up to output port 0. And I do. 58 records. Right there. All my accounts, all the information that I was looking for. So to connect to REST APIs using CloverDX, all we had to do was set up a connection between our API and CloverDX. We used OAuth for that today. And then we used the RESTConnector component and the OpenAPI specification for CloverDX to do most of the work for us in checking the endpoints and the required headers, etc. And I hope that this works for your API and that you're able to, just as quickly and easily as me, get the data that you're looking for from your API. Thanks.